My name is Brooke Hill, and this spring I turned 43. The day I sat across from him, my husband Solomon, with whom I had been married for 15 years, I felt that a long and difficult journey was coming to an end. It was the moment when everything that had been building up inside me came to the surface, but I merely sighed quietly, not wanting him to hear that hidden groan. He didn't know that for a long time, he had failed to elicit even the slightest response from me. Years ago, I was in love with him. I thought our meeting at the bar was destiny. I often went to that bar, not because I needed company, but more out of habit, to sit in the corner and retreat into my own world of thoughts, which, at the time, seemed quite significant to me. But then he approached me. His gaze was confident, like that of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He smiled, and in that instant, I felt my world change. His smile wasn't just a gesture, it was a whole universe, and I immediately wanted to reach it. We started talking, and with every word, it became clearer, I had fallen into his trap. He was the man every woman dreamed of, and his attention felt like a gift from above. That's how it all began. We didn't rush into decisions, but that evening was like a revelation. I, young, ambitious, and a bit naive, was charmed by his charisma, and in that moment, I felt that if he stayed with me, the world would seem completely different, beautiful and full of meaning. But now, years later, sitting across from him, I could hardly recall those feelings. Caught up in the endless routine of a marriage that had once been full of passion, I had reached a point where I couldn't remember when or why I first fell in love with this man. At first glance, Solomon hadn't changed. His gaze was still the same, confident, even a little mocking, his lips still twisted with the shadow of something insincere. On the outside, he was the same person, but inside, I couldn't find anything in him that would make me care about this moment, this conversation. Everything he said seemed like background noise. I couldn't believe that this man, who at the beginning of our marriage had seemed like the one who could make me happy, had now become the one who just reminded me every day that love can evaporate as quickly as it arises. And now, as he stood before me, wearing that same smug expression, I could barely suppress my disgust. His words were sharp, but his gaze was confident, as if he had already made up his mind for me, as if he was sure that in this battle, this duel with fate, he would come out the winner. "Actually, what would you prefer, divorce or care?" he asked, leaning back in his chair and looking at me like I was his property. This question felt like it had been prepared in advance, designed to force me into an unbearable choice. But I knew he didn't want a divorce, even though he pretended to make me decide. I had long understood, he didn't need me to leave. He needed me to stay. But not out of love. He needed that sense of power, of control. He despised me, but still kept me close, knowing full well that I couldn't leave. I looked at him, forcing myself not to grimace. I realized that these 15 years of marriage had been time wasted. Each year had added another layer of disappointment, and I understood that neither he nor I could ever return to what we once had. It was gone, melted away like smoke. I didn't feel pain at the thought. If anything, it was a sense of relief, because all that remained was emptiness, in which I could finally find freedom. Freedom he so desperately didn't want to allow me. I was like a bird in a cage, no longer dreaming of flight, but still aware that my wings were no longer what they once were. Solomon looked at me, expecting me to choose divorce, to break down and tell him that I could no longer live in this tyranny. But I was silent. I couldn't answer right away, not because I hesitated, but because I already knew the answer. I wasn't ready to change anything. I didn't want him to think his manipulations could work on me. I silently glanced at his unpleasant smirk, holding back the anger and fatigue that overwhelmed me. His word, care, only filled me with contempt. He didn't know that I had long since let him go, and at that moment, I didn't care whether it would be a divorce or the continuation of this nightmare. Gina, my mother-in-law, always thought she knew how to manage other people's lives. She was a woman who wasn't shy about voicing her opinions, even when they had nothing to do with her. We lived in different worlds, and at some point, I even started to see her as a figure from another time, hardly someone who could understand what was going on in my head, even if she tried. However, she wasn't particularly eager to understand me. Her goals were much simpler. This was before I started looking for a new job. At the time, I was consumed by what was happening in my life after my company literally collapsed before me. My dreams of a successful career, of freedom of choice and independence, dissolved in the haze of financial problems, debts, and poor decisions. I lost confidence in the future, and I was tormented by the thought that I could no longer control anything. And in that moment, Gina decided to help me by offering me to live on her terms. "Why don't you just stay home?" she asked, with a smile that, to me, didn't hide a hint of mockery. "Since you'll soon have children, show me my grandchildren. I'm waiting for you to become a mother." These words felt like a sentence, and I felt as if the whole world of her expectations and demands was crashing down on me. 6 months after our wedding, when Solomon and I still had no children, Gina started to pressure me. She thought it was her duty to make me understand that a woman must be a mother, and everything else, including a career, didn't matter. She tried to convince me that my professional life wasn't the most important thing, that there was something more important than independence, that family was the center of the universe. I remember the moment when she sat in our house, sipping tea, and began her endless speeches about how important it was to focus on the children, to be a good wife and mother, without getting distracted by unnecessary ambitions. She couldn't understand that for me, it was more of a burden than a blessing. And although at first, I managed to avoid her persistent suggestions, with each passing day, she became more insistent and even openly threatening. I could feel her words starting to torment me, and at some point, the thought struck me. She had long since decided that the life of my family should follow her blueprint. Gina saw the bankruptcy of my company, essentially the collapse of my entire independence, as a wonderful opportunity for me to stop looking for work and become a housewife. Honestly, it was hard to make ends meet living only on Solomon's income. He was still paying off college debts, and the living expenses he could provide were limited. We were barely scraping by, trying to survive on his salary and the minimal savings that were hard to hold on to. I knew that if it weren't for my determination to find a job, we would have ended up in an even worse situation. So, despite her pressure, I continued looking for a way out, even though I didn't know where I was headed. Eventually, I found a new job. But this attempt to regain my independence had an entirely unexpected effect. Gina saw it as a blow, as though I had betrayed her. She couldn't hide her displeasure, and soon her insults became regular. She told me that I didn't even understand what it took to be a real woman. She kept insisting that family should come first, and work was just a secondary concern. With each of her words, I could feel my nerves losing their resilience. "I want to see grandchildren soon," she said, pointing at me with her finger, "and Brooke doesn't understand my wishes at all." I knew that Gina wouldn't stop trying to impose her will on me. She believed I wasn't fulfilling the role she had imagined for me. Her words became like stabs, never allowing me peace. It wasn't just pressure, it was an unbearable weight that she was trying to force on me. In those moments, I could feel her will squeezing me, draining my strength and confidence. Sometimes I wondered if I should have fought this marriage from the start. Perhaps I was wrong in choosing Solomon, perhaps I wasn't ready to accept the lifestyle he had offered me. But what if he was the one who was right for me? What if I was wrong about everything else? After all, Solomon could find someone else who might suit him better. He was a good man, and I knew that he loved me, although his love had long since lost all sincerity. All of this became even clearer when his mother calmly, without a trace of hesitation, said these words in my presence. "Oh, I should have spoken out against this marriage. Solomon could have found someone who suited him much better." These words struck me deeply. Gina wasn't just pressuring me, she was challenging the very foundation of my existence, making me doubt myself. The reason I stayed in this marriage was becoming increasingly unclear. Sometimes, I tried to justify my actions, but they only seemed more and more meaningless. And now, here I was in the hospital after fainting at work, feeling that my life had long since crossed that line after which there is no turning back. The doctor diagnosed me with exhaustion. How could I have avoided it when I was simply trying to manage the money we managed to earn? In the past few months, I had been living as frugally as possible, counting every penny, cutting all possible expenses, even though Solomon kept complaining about our situation. More and more, he blamed me for not doing enough, for not earning more. His words hit me like hammers, but I remained in my usual role, hiding behind the mask of endless tolerance. When they came to the hospital, I immediately felt the coldness of their presence. They didn't come to see how I was feeling. They didn't show the slightest concern. Their faces were stern, even cruel, in their condemning tirade. "You're too weak to faint from exhaustion," Solomon said, and his words sounded like a verdict, as if he expected the impossible from me, as if I weren't good enough in this world full of demands and relentless pressure. "You can't even handle this," he continued, not hiding the irritation that seemed to swirl around him. I felt his cold discontent seeping deeper and deeper into me. Gina, standing next to him, added, "You're taking on too much. You can't live like this. We've already talked about this, haven't we, Brooke? You're too weakened by all this stress. Don't you understand that this is inconvenient for us? What if people think we're putting too much pressure on you? What if it brings shame on us?" Her words cut like a knife. It was clear to me that they didn't care about me, about my condition. They were only concerned with their own image. My weaknesses, my problems, my feelings, all of it was foreign to their worldview. I was just a failed element in their perfect picture, and they didn't hesitate to remind me of that. I felt the crushing pressure on my shoulders becoming unbearable, suffocated by this cruel criticism. Despite the pain and heaviness I felt, I gathered my strength to respond. At some point, I realized that if I didn't start speaking, I would completely lose myself, my identity, my worth. My silence was becoming my greatest enemy. "I can't keep going like this," I said with difficulty, feeling the words come out forcefully. "I can't be everything for you. I can't live for your expectations. I have my own limits, my own needs, and I won't pretend anymore that everything is fine." Solomon and Gina fell silent, but their silence wasn't one of understanding. No, it was a silence filled only with irritation and cold detachment. They didn't understand me, and I realized I wouldn't be able to explain any further. That day in the hospital became a turning point for me. I started to realize how far I had gone in submitting to these people, how long I had already lost touch with myself. In a world where everyone made decisions for me, where I was merely a reflection of someone else's hopes and demands, I had ceased to be myself. But was it still possible to get myself back? And what did of myself even mean anymore? I usually don't say much. I've gotten used to staying silent, absorbing blows, and enduring. But this time, when his words rang out again, I felt something break inside me. I wanted to protest, but before I could open my mouth, I heard his irritated voice. "But she's your mother, isn't she?" Solomon was always right, and that feeling overwhelmed me. An objection wouldn't change anything. I knew that as well as I knew that every attempt to speak up would just lead to another argument, to even more alienation. Everything I might say would be forgotten, and the consequences would inevitably fall on me. His irritation, his own justification. And I accepted it, as if there were no other way. Days passed, and I increasingly felt the weight building up inside me, a weight I couldn't shake off. Solomon complained that coming home was getting later and later, that he was often out of the house, but there was no care or guilt in his complaints, only irritation. He didn't realize how much I was struggling with myself, how I was facing a reality where he had become nothing but a shadow. I had no strength left to discuss his mother's condition, the demand she placed on me, her endless interference in my life. She was always standing between us, and I was feeling less and less that we were truly a family. Time passed, and I sank into routine. Morning turned to evening, and one day, while I was sitting in my office, lost in my thoughts, a call from the hospital suddenly interrupted me. I picked up the phone, immediately sensing that something was wrong. The voice on the other end was anxious, yet dry and professional. "Is this Brooke Hill?" asked an unfamiliar voice. "Your mother-in-law has been brought to the emergency room. She lost consciousness in the supermarket. We tried to contact your husband, but unfortunately, he didn't answer. We had to call you." My heart skipped several beats, but I pulled myself together. "Is she in danger?" I asked, although I knew from the start that this wasn't going to end well. I wasn't ready to lose yet another part of my life, another thread that had connected me to a world that was beginning to feel more and more foreign. "No," the doctor replied, "her life is not in danger, but she will need help with daily activities after discharge. We recommend that someone stay with her for a while." I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me, but then I remembered how she had always said that I couldn't handle difficulties, how her constant attacks had only worsened my exhaustion. And now, with this call, I was faced with a new reality, one where I might find myself in the role of a caretaker for the very woman who had always been against me. Leaving the office, I didn't think about anything other than getting to the hospital as quickly as possible. Everything else, all those days with Solomon and his mother, suddenly seemed so distant, so unimportant. My mother-in-law, despite her harshness and arrogance, was now in a vulnerable situation, and I couldn't avoid the feeling of responsibility that weighed on me. Perhaps this help was exactly what I needed, a chance to become something more than just a wife whose voice had no power. At the hospital, I was greeted by a stern but still friendly nurse who led me to the room. There, on the bed, surrounded by simple white sheets, lay Gina. Her face looked less imposing than I remembered. Against the backdrop of the white pillows, she appeared completely different, not the commanding woman, but an elderly lady in need of assistance. She wasn't the strong woman Solomon had always told me about. Now I understood how hard it must have been for her, despite her insistence on her beliefs. With a heavy heart, I approached her, and at the moment she looked up at me, I saw something different. Not criticism, not disdain, but fatigue. "Brooke," she said with difficulty, "you understand what I need, don't you? You need to help me, just a little." I didn't answer. Too many questions were spinning in my head. "I can't do everything on my own," the words slipped from my lips unexpectedly, even to myself. I wasn't sure why I chose to say them at that moment, but perhaps this honest, unthought-out reaction was exactly what I had been missing all this time. It was as if, suddenly, I had the chance to see Solomon for who he really was, not the idealized husband, but a man who, deep down, had always seen me as a kind of duty, something that existed to fulfill his demands. He looked surprised by my objection. For the past 15 years, he had grown so accustomed to my silence, to me holding back my feelings and desires, that any deviation from this script left him bewildered. He didn't even try to understand why I said those words, why, suddenly, I was showing defiance. And I realized that this wasn't just his habit, but my own as well. I had spent so long in a state where I allowed his neglect and humiliation to continue without objection. But now, I felt my words, those unspoken feelings until then, start to break free, like a flood bursting through a dam. And though I didn't immediately recognize it as my desperation, my soul could no longer stay in the shadows. Solomon furrowed his brow, his face becoming even more tense. He didn't like it when I spoke out, when my thoughts and feelings moved beyond his controlled world. I could see how his voice turned sharp and cold when he said, "So, what will it be, divorce or custody?" Choose whichever you prefer." "I don't care." Those words struck me like a heavy stone, shattering the illusion of stability I had been trying to build in our marriage. He said it with such contempt, such indifference, that I became scared for my own perception of the world, scared that I had been waiting and hoping all this time that he would see me as a person, not just as someone who existed to satisfy his will. He smirked. It was the same smirk I had come to recognize over all these years, a smirk full of confidence in his superiority, in the belief that I wouldn't be able to choose anything else, that my options were limited to whatever he deemed possible. He was so sure that I had nowhere to go, that I stayed in this marriage only out of inertia, out of habit. But his words, his unpleasant, cold smirk, suddenly felt like an enormous choice that he had imposed on me. Me? You're not on good terms with your parents, and if we get divorced, who are you going to rely on? He continued, with obvious irony in his voice. A single woman will find it hard to live decently on such a small salary. If you leave me, you're finished. I froze. It wasn't just a threat, it was a blatant acknowledgement of his control over me. It was both insulting and painful. He knew how to reduce me to a state where I couldn't resist his words, where they became the only reality. And in his voice, there wasn't just aggression, but something deeper, contempt, a conviction that I didn't deserve anything better, that I would never be able to become anyone more important without him. Can you even survive without me? His last words came like mockery, a reminder that I was dependent on him, that my life had no meaning without his presence. And there was another trap in this, his certainty that I would stay, that I wouldn't be able to choose either divorce or custody. That I couldn't live without him, that no one would value me. A storm raged inside me. Solomon's words wouldn't let me rest. He had no idea how much I had changed over the years, how much I had changed, even though everything seemed the same on the outside. He didn't know that inside me, the woman who once thought her life could only be with him was long gone. Your mother loves giving orders, and she'll be even more demanding after she's discharged. These words, spoken with a hint of contempt, seemed to spill from his lips, leaving me with mixed feelings. I couldn't believe he still didn't understand how deeply his words hurt me. He wasn't ready to hear my objection. He wasn't capable of accepting that I had started to see everything differently, that my patience and silence had reached their limits. In his eyes, I was still the same submissive wife he had known all these years, a woman who was supposed to obey and be grateful for what she had, or at least, that's what he thought. I looked at him with cold determination, but his mother's words left a heavy mark on my consciousness. His confidence, his beliefs, his reduction of all my desires to nothing, that was his reality. But I could no longer stay within its confines. I needed something more than just being a pawn in his hands, than just fulfilling his expectations like a machine. I was tired. He continued, sensing how my eyes had blazed over, as if I were starting to see through him. It was no longer just a misunderstanding, it was something more, and his voice grew sharp and tense. No, it's a misunderstanding, it was just a conversation. A bit of fun, not an affair. Solomon clearly tried to justify himself, but in his voice, I heard weakness. He stumbled over his words, his confidence started to evaporate, and he came up with more excuses, as if words could make his rightness real. Oh, just a bit of fun, yeah, right, I wasn't planning on anything serious. His words became empty sounds to me, no longer able to overshadow the pain I was feeling. I sighed heavily, feeling my tolerance for his excuses fading away. He stood before me, waiting for a response, but I knew I could no longer continue this conversation. Not this way. Not with this person. I pulled out my smartphone, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. This was the moment when I could no longer remain silent, when the truth had to come out. Not letting him continue, I played the audio file and held the phone up to his face. His voice, so familiar and confident, now echoed in the room like a brand. I pressed play, and Solomon's words filled the space. I'm going to divorce my wife soon, and then marry you right after. I will protect you for the rest of your life. Hearing this, I felt a knot form in my stomach, and a heaviness settled on my chest, as if someone had gripped me in a tight hold. His sweet, confident voice, spoken with such ease and disdain for my personality and for the relationship I had been trying to preserve, sounded like sharp pain. This was the moment when the entire charade, the illusion of our marriage, vanished. I couldn't believe I had to hear these words from the person I had once loved, with whom I had hoped to share my life. I saw his face drain of color, and his eyes, filled with fear and confusion, froze on the phone screen. He tried to say something, but his lips found no words. He stared at me as if I were a stranger, demanding an explanation for what this all meant. "How do you have this?" His voice was tense, demanding. He wanted to know how I could have such compromising material, how I could have kept it from him. "Is this all true?" I didn't answer immediately. Everything inside me had collapsed with this revelation, but I knew that this moment had been long awaited, that I could no longer remain silent. I searched for words to sever everything between us, once and for all. "This is just part of the evidence collected by the detective agency," I said coldly, watching as his face changed, as he realized that nothing could hide the truth anymore. He was silent. My heart was pounding wildly, and in that moment, I felt a strange relief. It was as if I had been freed from everything that had bound me. All that I had endured, all his lies, all his manipulations, now laid bare before him. And there was no longer any force that could return to me what I had once lost. I was no longer his wife, I was a woman who had finally found her voice. At my next job, I started from scratch, as a simple sales assistant, despite the extensive experience that, I thought, should have helped me find my way much faster. Yet, standing at this new beginning, I felt something unexpectedly refreshing. The pressure I felt in the first days slowly disappeared, giving way to a new challenge. Everything felt new, yet familiar at the same time. I hadn't just returned to the work environment, I had re-examined my own ambitions. The start was modest, but it was enough to feel the strength beginning to build again. Initially, I was assigned to a sales administrator role. It was a difficult but still secondary position, offering neither high status nor special privileges. Nonetheless, I saw it as an opportunity to establish myself in the new company, to prove that I could work not just in higher positions, but also in the lowest ones, which, sometimes, might even be more important. I didn't reject the job but used it as a platform for the next step. Then something interesting appeared, a system that promised additional bonuses for success, not just a fixed salary. This idea intrigued me more and more, as it offered the chance for growth and development. But even though I was optimistic, I heard Solomon's familiar complaint. He always believed he earned more than I did. And when I had to listen to yet another of his speeches about how he deserved more, I felt my dissatisfaction growing. He directly asked his boss to transfer him to the sales department, claiming that he was as capable as I was, and it was something like jealousy that filled his words. He couldn't understand why I wasn't using my career to earn more. And while I could have explained to him that a career in sales was only a stepping stone to something greater, his criticism made me feel that I needed to prove to him, and to myself, that I could do more. So, I took on the challenge, deciding I would be the first person to move from an administrative position to the sales department in the company. Although the sales role was demanding and required significant effort, I was determined. It wasn't just about ambition, it was a fight for myself, for the opportunity to break free from the ideal that had been imposed on me. In this battle, there was something liberating, something that made me feel my worth beyond the world I had previously existed in. The company, as it turned out, was experiencing a serious shortage of personnel in the sales department, and help was urgently needed. My move wasn't just welcome, it was necessary. When the administrative sales tasks were handed over to a newly hired employee, I fully focused on sales. I no longer had to worry about documents or organizational work. I immersed myself in the world of direct negotiations, decisions, and sales, and it turned out to be exactly what I needed. Working in sales was indeed challenging, as expected. It required not only high qualifications but also the ability to adapt quickly, act under stress, and make decisions on the spot. Yet, surprisingly, this job suited me. There was something compelling about it, not just because of the potential bonuses, but because I finally felt that I was actually doing something, achieving something. I wasn't just existing, following someone else's orders. I was at the center of the process, involved in shaping the outcome. The results were swift. I achieved numbers comparable to those of my male colleagues, which became a sort of proof that I could be successful not only within the limits of my usual duties, but also in an entirely new context. I managed to overcome my internal doubts and bring to life ambitions that had no place in my previous life. It wasn't just an achievement, it was the moment I realized that I could move forward, no matter what was happening at home, in my marriage with Solomon. Solomon never treated me as his equal. He saw me as a convenient tool, a sort of servant who should be on standby, fulfilling all his wishes and needs. When we met, when we started dating, he was different. He could be attentive, even kind. He listened to me, paid attention to my words, creating the illusion that he valued my opinion, that he understood me. But all of that was false, a mask hiding someone ready for manipulation, for domination, someone who wanted to make me live in his world, by his rules. When we got married, I thought everything would change. That this was the long-awaited harmony, when two people become one. But with each passing year, with every new storm, I began to realize that something was wrong with him. And perhaps I just didn't want to see it before. Maybe I was deceiving myself, hoping for the best, believing that love would overcome everything. But with each month, each year, I saw him turn into a cold, distant person. His kindness disappeared, his attention gave way to indifference. And now, in this decisive moment, I could no longer ignore the fact that he was a stranger, not the person I thought he was, not the one I had loved. I searched for justifications for his behavior for a long time. But now I understood that the entire game had been just a trick, a manipulation created by him to keep me under control. Our whole life had turned into a game, where he was always the winner, and I, always the loser. He humiliated me, used me, and at some point, I realized that such a life no longer made sense. Who would want to stay with such a person? Who would want to keep fighting for something that had long lost its value? So, despite all my confusion and pain, I made a choice. I chose divorce. I couldn't continue this game. I couldn't keep living in a world where his contempt had become my everyday reality. I couldn't care for a mother-in-law who had never valued me, who had never respected me. Even if they offered me money, a material reward for it, I would have refused. It would have been just another attempt to manipulate me, another way to force me to stay in this slavery. When my mother-in-law lost consciousness and was taken to the hospital, I realized that her body had grown weak, but her mind remained as sharp as ever. It was a strange, even frightening realization. She wasn't just a sick person, she remained the same authoritative, demanding being who always looked down on me, as if I were someone meant to serve her. When she regained consciousness, I knew that if they offered me to care for her after discharge, it would become a new phase of humiliation for me. She would probably treat me not as a person, but as a servant, someone to be used at her discretion. Perhaps, before, I would have considered such an option if she had respected me even a little, if she had appreciated my effort, my affection. But expecting respect from her was completely unrealistic. I had long understood that she was incapable of it, and I no longer needed her approval. It was not my duty to please her, to be her shadow and fulfill her demands. My life shouldn't be reduced to this. And when Solomon, confidently sitting in his chair and making his usual statements, forced me to choose between divorce and caring for my mother-in-law, I already knew that my answer wouldn't change. He wanted me to make a choice. But I understood that this wasn't just a choice between two things. It was a choice between a life that I could handle and a life that was increasingly becoming my prison. Solomon thought that I would give in, that I would fall into his trap again, just like before. But now I knew that I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't continue being part of his world, a world that left no room for my own self. Solomon's face twisted with rage when I announced my decision. His hands clenched into fists, but it no longer mattered. He had humiliated me again, acting as though I were his subordinate, his thing, meant to serve him, to satisfy his desires and whims. He never expected that I would seek revenge, that I would finally gather all my anger and pay him back for the years when his arrogance and selfishness destroyed everything alive inside me. I looked at his face, and it became clear to me that he still didn't understand. This tyranny he had imposed on me, this constant humiliation, couldn't go on forever. I felt everything inside me boiling, my heart pounding heavily in my chest, but no longer out of love. Now it beat with anger. I was disappointed in him, in myself, and in our marriage. He wasn't the person I had once thought he was. I regretted ever marrying him, regretted ever believing his lies and what seemed like endless kindness. It had all been a lie, vanity, a game. "I'll start packing my things, and you can sort out the rest," I said, not looking at him. My voice was firm, even though everything inside me was crumbling. I felt my legs move quickly, almost running. The farther I went from him, the easier it became. But the next moment, I felt someone's hand suddenly grab the edge of my clothes, stopping me in my tracks. I turned sharply and saw him, Solomon, his face twisted with despair. "Wait, let go, I don't. I have no money," his voice trembled, like someone who had suddenly encountered reality. It was so absurd that I froze in place. But what struck me the most was that his pride had suddenly disappeared, and in place of his usual arrogance, I saw an insecure man who seemed to have only now started to realize the consequences of his actions. I frowned. These words were like a blow, even though I had already become accustomed to his manipulations and games. But this was something new, something I never expected to hear from him. "I fell in love with a stripper and bought her a bunch of designer clothes to get her attention," he said, as if justifying himself, but it was so absurd that I could barely hold back a laugh. He continued, "Because of this, my savings are almost gone. That's why I don't have any money to give you." I stood there, unable to say a word. His honesty shocked me, but not in the way he probably expected. Instead of apologizing or asking for forgiveness, he was explaining to me why he couldn't give me what I was owed, without even realizing how low that was. But what struck me the most was when he continued, "I even took a little from my mother's pension." I froze, trying to process what I had just heard. It wasn't just a revelation, it was a betrayal. I never imagined he could go that far. To take from his mother, using her pension for his own needs, it was something I couldn't fathom. "It's unbelievable that you used your mother's pension," I said with disdain, not hiding my astonishment. "I'm hearing about this for the first time, but it seemed like that's exactly what you did." He probably expected me to react with pain or sympathy, but instead, all I felt was disgust. It was low. It was revolting. I couldn't believe he had sunk to this level. I glanced at his face and saw how his confidence disappeared, leaving only emptiness and despair. After the divorce, Solomon stayed with the same woman who had filled his life during our marriage. The stripper, who seemed like his salvation, was to me the embodiment of everything he once considered a replacement for a real life. Life with her was just as much of an illusion as his relationship with me had been. It was nothing but superficial pleasures and empty promises. He was no longer tied to our home, to our marriage, but he lost everything he once had: his self-confidence, his status, respect, and the deep feelings we once shared. Instead, he found himself trapped by a woman who sought nothing but her own benefit. Solomon had always been obsessed with the desire to appear successful, even if the price of success was too high. He spent a lot of money on the stripper, and with it, he spent his last shred of pride. When he proposed to her, it seemed like he no longer realized that his life had long turned into a catastrophe. But the stripper, who had used his feelings as a manipulation, rejected him. She didn't need to be tied to someone like him, and apparently, she was satisfied with what she was squeezing out of him to provide herself with a comfortable life. She even insisted that he never come back to the club where they had met, severing all ties with him, Solomon was bewildered. He couldn't understand why his feelings weren't reciprocated, why his efforts didn't lead to the desired result. His attempts to win her over, to be someone important to her, seemed pointless. All he had gained from their relationship was another broken heart and a deep sense of disappointment. He continued to sincerely believe that if he offered her everything he had left, she would stay. But her decision had nothing to do with his love, it was more about her interests. When I found out that their relationship had ended, when I heard how he had been kicked out of the club where he had so desperately spent money trying to regain her attention, I didn't feel schadenfreude or joy. I didn't seek an apology from her. All I felt was relief, rather than satisfaction. I had long understood that he deserved what had happened to him. But my life had already been too deeply affected by him, and now that we had parted ways, I wasn't interested in delving into his failures. 15 years of life together was a whole era. And during those years, I had seen the person he once was disappear. The Solomon I had once loved, the one I had hoped to build a future with, had become colder and more cool with each passing year. He forgot what it meant to be humane, he forgot how important it was to value other people rather than just using them as tools for his own pleasure. And now, here I was, standing on the threshold of a new life. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew that everything I had gone through had become a part of my journey. Solomon was no longer a part of my life, and although this liberation came with pain and disappointment, I felt myself growing stronger with each passing day, with every minute that moved me farther away from his shadow. As for him, his life was now just a chain of mistakes and losses, and perhaps at some point, he realized this. But his helplessness could not overshadow my freedom. With his departure, I had gained a new independence, and perhaps this was the moment when I finally felt I could start over. Solomon chose a woman who used him for her own purposes, and now, when everything had collapsed, he was left alone, surrounded by the ruins of his choices. But what had been a loss for him became a chance for me to begin a new life.